Her name was Florence, but everyone in the church of my childhood called her Mom. Mom was one of the widows in our church, and they all sat together in a pew on the left-hand side of the congregation from the front of the church, about 5 rows from the front. Their numbers fluctuated over the years, as some were added, some were buried. Back in those days, people didn't remarry. The men seemed to die first, and the women moved to the widow's row. I knew enough about Mom from my parents to know that she had raised her children, my parents' contemporaries, and a little after they were out of school and the service, World War II, Mom's husband died. She lived alone in the family home on the hill above the church in Allison Park, Pennsylvania. She lived simply. She dressed simply. Her hair was always pulled back in a rather severe bun, but the kindness of her face made up for the severity of her hair. She was involved in the life of the church and did everything and more than the women did in the church of her day. She was one of the first women to be ordained as an elder when the church had accepted the equality of men and women. And she had a smile that would melt ice. When I was in the junior choir of our church, I had a bird's eye view of the widow's row. Our choir loft was in the front of the church, and we could look forward. The only downside was that our parents could see us clearly. Mom anchored the aisle seat of her row. She looked up the lessons for the day in her very well-worn Bible. She rose to her feet, always a little early for the hymn. She glowed when worship began. And when the offering plate came by, she always had something to put in. She may not have had 2 pennies to rub together, but she always had something for the offering. And when she put it in the offering plate, her smile beamed. She loved giving. I always think of Mom when I read that passage from the Gospel of Mark that is at the heart of our worship today. The story of the widow's offering has a face in my mind's eye. It's Mom's face. We're in the 3rd week of our 4-part series of stewardship generosity sermons that are leading us up to next Sunday's celebration when we will receive the pledges of financial support from this congregation for the next 18 months. We've already received some leadership pledges toward the effort. They indicate a renewed sense of generosity, kindness, and commitment that will be needed to take up the challenging work to which we are called. And my hunch is that very often many of us look at what others have done and think about what others have done and say to ourselves, I can't do that. I can't give that much, and what I can won't make much of a difference. We sometimes feel defeated, unnecessary, maybe even insignificant, and so we decide to do nothing at all. In our verse for the week from Jane Laurie Borthwick's hymn, Come Labor On, we read these words. Come labor on, away with gloomy doubts and faithless fears. No arms so weak but may do service here. Though feeble agents, may we all fulfill God's righteous will. No arms so weak but may do service here. The way that Mark's gospel tells our story for the morning means that you have to see both stories because they are told in their order for a reason. There are 2 stories, and they rely on each other. The first story is the story of a teaching Jesus offered in which he takes the religious leaders to task. They do not have the requisite humility, modesty, or unassuming nature that Jesus seems to think religious leaders should have. He condemns them for walking around in their long robes, being greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and having the very best seats in the synagogue and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearances, say long prayers. You cannot read those words and not think of descriptions such as unauthentic, bogus, counterfeit. Jesus attacks egotism and avarice that masks itself as holiness and sanctity. It is over against the false piety of the religious leaders that the story of a genuinely pious and devout widow is told. We know her only as a poor widow who came to the temple treasury to present her offering to God. The gospel tells us that she had 2 small copper coins, with the point being that the coin was the smallest unit of money in that time and place, and that the woman, having only 2, gave all that she had. Jesus contrasts her gift with those of the rich who were placing large sums into the temple treasury. Theirs were probably calculated gifts, guided by the law of the tithe and a long tradition of how that was to be figured. Hers surely was not. She might have kept one of those coins, but did not. Instead, she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, her whole living. Jesus might have scolded the woman for her lack of prudence in giving both coins, or for a lack of discretion in giving them to a decadent religious establishment. But instead, he praises her highly. The widow and her outrageous gift reflect another gift that would be given. Her gift foreshadows the offering that Jesus would make, his very life. In Mark's gospel, this poor widow becomes a reflection of the one who, though he was rich, yet for our sake became poor, so that by his poverty we might become rich. And there is a lesson we would do well to learn. Before we talk about the amounts of our gifts, it's important to remember that we give because God has given to us. We offer our gifts because of the gifts that have been offered to us. Our giving is to be a reflection of God's giving. The attitude in giving is supremely important. A large gift given out of some sense of obligation, grudgingly or resentfully, is a gift that will never really make a difference in the world because it never really made a difference in the life of the giver. I was watching the funeral mass of Francis Cardinal George, the former Archbishop of Chicago, who died last week after a long battle with cancer. In the homily, Cardinal George's friend, Archbishop Peter Sartain, reminded the congregation of something that Cardinal George once said. He said, "The only thing we take with us when we die is what we have given away." We cannot take with us all our accumulated wealth and possessions. We cannot take with us our degrees and certificates of achievements. We cannot take any of the things the world would have us value. We can only take with us the spiritual practice of giving and what we have given away. Our need to give and our joy in giving is ultimately the greatest of life's lessons. Giving with joy and happiness changes us, and changes us for the better. And in the kingdom of God, it is not the size of the gift that is given, but the heart with which it is given. It is not about the amount that is given. Pete may disagree, but I'll bet he doesn't. It is the gratitude and recognition and appreciation with which the gift is given. The greatest gifts are not given out of obligation or requirement, but they are given because the giver realizes that all of life's gifts are given to us by God. There was a woman in one of my former congregations who used to regularly tell me that if she ever won the lottery, she would give half of it to the church. I offered to personally buy her a lottery ticket a week for life. But once, after making the same promise she had always made, she looked at me and said, "I don't think I'll ever win the lottery. It's just that I would really love to do something really big for the church." I told her she already had. Her heart had been converted, and so had her pocketbook. She began giving a little more each year than the previous year, until I worried that she might be giving too much. She gave gladly, generously, and gratefully. And that's the way it is in the kingdom of God. In 1987, I received a phone call from the person at the Oakmont home in Pittsburgh who was responsible for scheduling preachers to come in to conduct a Sunday afternoon service for the residents. When you are a cub preacher, you are only sure of preaching the Sunday after Christmas and the Sunday after Easter. So you jump at the chance to go anywhere to preach. So I agreed, and on the appointed day, I made my way to the Oakmont Presbyterian home. When I got there, I was shown to the chapel, and I went up to the pulpit and began getting myself organized. And then I looked up, and there, about 5 rows from the front, on the left-hand side, sat Mom. The face was a bit more drawn, and there were a few more lines on that face than I had remembered. The bun was still on her head, though it was a bit whiter than before. And the smile was there. And it was directed at me. I walked down, and we got reacquainted. Her hearing was a little less than what she would have liked, and her eyes had dimmed to the point where she could no longer read, but only carry her well-worn Bible. Truth be told, I think she had most of it memorized anyway. She said the kind of things you might expect someone who cared about you to say. She was interested in my church. She was interested in knowing about my mother and father and sister and brother. We caught up. And then, and I do not know to this day what grace prompted me to say it, I looked at her and I said, "Mom, I want to thank you." "Thank me? Whatever for?" "For always being in the 5th row. For always enjoying worship. For always putting something in the plate that helped me learn the stories of Jesus." We both had a couple of tears. And then she said to me, "And look what we got." Wow. I hope that in whatever corner of heaven she calls home, she still feels that way. Gifts small or large, given in love, given in gratitude, given in thanksgiving. There is no arm so weak, but may do service here. We may be feeble agents, but together, sharing what we have, giving gifts, practicing generosity, we may just yet fulfill God's righteous will.